I was really interested, Genevieve, in your comments that it's actually women in their 40s, 50s and 60s who are major users of this technology. Possibly coming as relief to all of us who've been paranoid about trying to understand audiences in their teens and in their 20s and where the technology is going, what the technology is doing. And I think one of the ways that I've thought about this and approached this is that when I was in my teens and early 20s, I was listening to the radio and I was watching television. And so therefore migrating to the public broadcast of the ABC, I already had the pattern of media consumption established. Then it was, well, what's the outlet that's meeting my needs? And so I think in the Australian experience, there was certainly a sense of people growing up and migrating and moving to the public broadcaster. But when those habits of radio and television aren't as strongly entrenched, and I think of my teenage daughters who don't listen to much radio at all, I'm kind of worried that down the track, do you have to build a radio habit and then migrate them to the ABC? Are we looking in the wrong place here? Are we wrong, media organisations around the world, to be too obsessed about the media habits and patterns of people in their teens and in their 20s?
Well, far be it for me to suggest you were wrong, so no. But I think one of the interesting challenges is that we somehow imagine that what people are doing in their teenage years will dictate what they do later. And you know, I can guarantee there were things you were doing when you were 17 that you don't do now. Almost guarantee it. Yeah, exactly. And the joys of being a trained social scientist, yeah, good. What we also, I think, sometimes forget about this particular cohort, and I'd say, you know, anywhere from sort of, you know, 10 to 20 now, is that as parents, we are funding their media habits. So I'm willing to bet most of you in the room who have small children, you are paying for their devices, their infrastructure, their various payment plans, so the number of text messages they can send, the number of sites, their iTunes accounts is mostly afforded by their families. One of the things we've found is that as soon as kids move out from their parents supporting their media habits, and if they go to a university where the university effectively supports their media habits, is the point at which they stop having someone else supporting their media habits. It's remarkable how their media habits change. And it's the moral equivalent of saying, you go to a buffet, all you can eat, you eat all you can. You go to a restaurant where you have to pay for it by the plate, you change your eating habits. And so one of the things we found is that as people are graduating out of a kind of afforded media, smorgasbord extravaganza, they pare back what they're consuming. What's been interesting for us, though, is that we actually see certain kinds of media stabilising in people's lives. I think it's safe to say there's always television. How it's delivered, and I think you're right about it being just-in-time and catch-up delivery rather than scheduled broadcasting. There's certainly more of a propensity to reach out to multiple sources and do a comparison. I don't think it was possible in any of our youths. But for us, the data is quite clear, at least coming out of the US and Western Europe. And I will confess I know less about Australia in this particular space. But we're really interested to see how much certain technologies and platforms and channels reappear, and how much is actually related to life stage rather than cohort and generation. And that it is about what you do when you are young and fancy-free. It's very different than the first time you had a serious relationship, or a mortgage, or your first job. And watching as that is transitioning has been very interesting. Second thing I would say is that what we've also seen starting to come out, and it's just emerging now, so I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, is that we're now, 5 years into the sort of social networking quote-unquote revolution, and tracking the kids who are coming into American universities, where I know this data best, is they're now the younger brothers and sisters, basically, of people who led their entire lives on Facebook at university. Their relationship to what they want to post is completely different than their older siblings, because they've seen what it meant to have their older siblings effectively broadcast everything, and that cohort there seems to be much more private. And I'm really interested to see whether we're sort of, we somehow thought Facebook meant that a certain kind of genie was out of the bottle, and I'm actually not convinced that's what's happening.
Do you think media organisations are basically under-researching or are not investigating this cohort that you identified as women in their 40s, 50s and 60s? Are we paying enough attention to their habits and learning enough from what they're doing?
Well, so remember when I said, the peril at my organisation was that we had this fantasy of who our users were, and it was this lovely 3 generations of happy people in a blank room waiting for us to turn up and delight them. I think one of the things we need to be better at, no matter what our organisation is being rigorous about remembering who our audience actually is, as opposed to the audience we think we should be chasing. And I think for us, being really clear about what it meant to design for the right audience has actually been an interesting challenge. And I don't think you have to, it's not an either or, right? I think, it's absolutely right to be investing in the cohorts that are coming, because irrespective of whether they're smaller than the ones you're already tackling, they will be part of your audience. But I think, we have often done that at the expense of everyone else. And it's very clear to me when you look at this cohort of lead adopters of women, they have a number of things in common, right? They tend to be quite time poor, so they are in some form of labour as well as still bearing the bulk of domestic work. So they're still doing the bulk of cooking and cleaning and child rearing and all that sort of stuff. And while men have stepped up, thank you, that was good, women are still bearing much of that work. So what we find is that technologies that let women time shift things, so ebooks, huge winner. 70% of ebook ownership is with women, and the number of books that women are reading has actually gone up in the last 5 years. And it's partly because you no longer needed to go to a shop, you could time shift, you could get it when you wanted it. Same with both the BBC iPlayer and ABC's iView, is that I know the statistics on both of those is that you actually saw early traction amongst women because it meant you could watch television when everything else had been done, or you could move it into these moments when you had pieces of spare time. So when you look at all those technologies, that you see a kind of a dominant women's presence, they're about time shifting, they're about things that fit into a life of multitasking, and they're also about things that are either about communication or sort of social networking in a more traditional sense. So it's actually about moving the family and the network and the community forward.
Now, questions is now, Stuart. Stuart, you better tell everyone. I know who you are, but you better tell everyone.
I will indeed. Hi, Genevieve. Thank you for a very entertaining presentation, and welcome back to Australia. I was particularly pleased to hear you talking about users. I'm Stuart Watt from the ABC's News Online service, and we spend a lot of time trying to predict what our users want from us. I must say, often grappling around in the dark without much of an idea about what they want. So it's great to hear that someone is actually taking a scientific approach to the subject. I was just hoping you could expand a little bit on this idea of big data. As journalists, when we think about data and the internet, we tend to think about the data that is available to us to sift through and that comes from corporations and government departments. But I presume you're talking more about the data that's available about users, about the demographics, what they want, and how we're likely to interact with them.
Yeah, it's a good question, Stuart. I'm actually pushing that even further, right? So at the moment, you're right, we have streams of data that are kind of obviously generated. We're moving into a world where most devices also generate data sort of sui generis, by themselves, basically. So if you have a smartphone, it generates a data trail that at the moment probably only your local service provider can read. And that trail will tell you where you make the most calls, what cell sites you go through, what sites you visit on your phone. And increasingly all the devices in your ensemble of devices do some version of this. What websites you go to, what traffic, how long you're on the network. It's also the case that we're moving to a world that's sometimes called the Internet of Things, where in fact a lot of other devices that we don't own also generate that data. Traffic lights, water taps, electrical meters all start to generate patterns. And for both governments as well as various companies and corporations, there are opportunities, as far as people see it, to start thinking about what you can do with that. Now, if you were, some of the most, sort of the first places that are kind of Internet of Thinging up their cities, which is a great phrase, but Internet of Thing up it, seem to be in China, where they're talking about, could you start to link the data streams that come from traffic lights, water consumption, electricity, and start to be able to predict, because effectively all the loos have flushed and all the showers have gone on, that this city is now basically up and about to go to the office 10 minutes later than usual for any number of reasons, so we need to now stagger the traffic lights differently to respond to it. So, could you start to do connected city kind of control stuff? Of course, what all of that also means is that any one of those basically silos of data or buckets of data is only as good as your ability to make sense of it, right? So this is less about what we as researchers might be able to access as it is about how those sources of data start to become visible. So if you've got the traffic light out on Grey Street, has a data thread, can we start to see that? And are there things that tells us that, we know people run through the red light only at 5 o'clock at night, or the button for the pedestrians gets pushed more on a Saturday night at 8 o'clock when the movie cinema lets out. So we might need to think about how we reconfigure pedestrian traffic. So part of it's going to be about how do you start to make that data visible, but part of it's also going to be about how is sense-making applied to that data. And for me, the most interesting stuff is starting to happen about what sorts of data connect to other sorts of data. So, you know, it's really tempting to say, you know, pick on the traffic light on Grey Street. You know, it's just a traffic light, so we just need to connect it to other traffic lights. But any of you who've been on the South Bank on a Saturday night know there are some other things down the road you might need to connect it to too, like the cinema and, you know, the time that the movies are going on. So how do you start to know what data links to other data? I mean, effectively, it's not unlike a moral equivalency how journalists made stories, right? You had to work out what piece of a story fit to something else that actually made a bigger story. And the challenge here when we talk about big data in the kind of global sense here is about how are those different streams going to get connected up. Now, you could reasonably then ask, because I think it is the second question, what does that start to mean in terms of data integrity and privacy? Because frankly, you know, you may not imagine that that traffic light outside your house is actually tracking you, but if we know enough about your habits, we can probably work out when you're using that traffic light or what you're doing with your mobile phone. And I think, you know, some of the interesting questions start to become, and they're certainly being hashed out at the EU and to a lesser extent in some of the American governments about what does it mean, who owns that data, for starters, right? Pretty clear about the mobile phone, although that's ambiguous globally about who owns the data your phone produces. In the UK, you do. In America, the mobile phone company does. Who owns the data that the traffic light produces? Interesting question. How is that going to be commodified? Because you know it will be. And by whom and in what contexts? And we've seen some of this happening already. Think about some of the open sourcing of data by the Australian government, for instance, some of those mashups of data, Web 2.0 stuff. This is on a much larger scale where many, many things now generate data and the supplies of it get more and more. And clearly, you know, this is good for people who make servers, yay. This is interesting for people who make networks because that becomes a challenge. And then there are some really interesting questions at law about where that data ultimately resides. This is also part of the conversation about the cloud, right? As you know, data, while it is zeros and ones, ultimately rests somewhere. So where the server farms are physically located, on whose networks the data runs, and how it moves, all become interesting questions. The only analog of which I have is sort of the early post office, was that letters eventually had to go through a post office to be stamped to move along the sort of system. So there are questions there about what all of that is going to look like.
I'm sorry we don't have a lot more time, but we're just about out. Just one final question here, I think. And the microphone, here it comes.
Hi, Phil Harding. My question is also about big data, and I think you began to answer it actually in the second half of the answer you just gave, because you used the word feral when you talked about big data, which is a very interesting word. Could you just say a bit more about how you think big data is going to be feral?
It's so nice to be in an audience where people would know what that is. So one of the things I'm really struck by as someone who researches at the intersection of culture and technology is that most of the conceptual language we use comes out of economics. So that we talk about, you know, supply and demand. There's a lot of kind of notions of the analytic over things like big data that are very rational economics. For me, one of the things that I think is very clear from all of our experiences with technology is that it very rarely stays contained inside the boundaries, right? And, you know, we've already seen examples of data warehouses being hacked for any number of reasons. So whether it was, you know, credit card companies or payment systems or websites, there have been those kind of hacks that are opening up the data. I think we're also going to be at an interesting moment when not only does the data itself start to exist beyond the device that created it or beyond its infrastructure, but algorithms, and again, I know this sounds really geeky, algorithms that make sense of data produce new data in the sense making, right? So effectively, you know, you've got the data here, you put it through a filter, and new data gets created. I think we know less about what that new data that's being created is going to do, and less of a sense about how it might be controlled, where it might go, and what its life cycle is. And I can't help be struck by the comparisons here to rabbits for the Australians. Well, you know, we had some rabbits, we had them behind a fence, we thought it was all good. Rabbits ran away, we built a new fence, rabbits kept going, rabbits had more rabbits. We tried to kill rabbits, rabbits had more and more rabbits, we built new fences. There are some metaphors and some structures we put in place to think about data, firewalls, gates, controls, security locks. And my sense is that some of these algorithms that are being created have the capacity to make data that will be uncontrollable. And for me, feral is the only lens I could get to that's useful. And then I think it becomes really instructive, oddly enough, to actually go and look at some of the Australian stories about feral, because there's the rabbit story and there's the camel story. And I haven't decided yet whether big data is the rabbits or the camels. And there are days when I think it might be more like the camels, i.e. it will just populate the entire middle of Australia while none of us notice. And then some day we'll go, oh, we have 750 million camels. How did that happen? And big data has that capacity too, right, where it will replicate invisibly, and then someone will discover it. And I think there's something about that notion of a thing that is made for one circumstance and is domesticated, but has in it the capacity to run, jump the fence and run wild. And my sense is algorithms are that bridging moment, right?
I think we need to pause there before we get on to cane toads, because I don't think our visitors need to know about cane toads. Thanks so much. Will you thank Genevieve Bell for a terrific presentation to start our session? Thank you.